Drink it all. You won't feel a thing.
The story opens with an older man named Norm, who is the leader of a criminal organization. He holds a meeting with his son-in-law and several members of the group. During the gathering, Norm informs everyone that they must prepare for his departure because their organization still owes a large debt that needs to be paid. After the celebration ends, Norm and his men leave and go to a slaughterhouse. There, Norm speaks with the owner, but the mood quickly becomes tense when he learns that the business has been struggling for a long time and still hasn't repaid the money owed to his organization. Norm intends to take control of the factory, but the owner refuses to sign the transfer papers, despite previously promising to repay the debt. Bull, who is accompanying Norm, realizes the owner is trying to stall and becomes increasingly irritated. Losing patience, Bull confronts him and, after a tense exchange, ends up cutting off several of the owner's fingers. This violent act forces the owner to finally sign the documents handing the factory over. On their way back, Bull notices that Gary, the team member who originally loaned the money, is nowhere to be seen and begins to wonder what happened to him. Gary was supposed to step in and handle the issue, but when Bull questioned him, both he and the rest of the team remained silent. That evening, Bull noticed Gary's car parked in his driveway. Curious and uneasy, he went inside to see what was going on. To his shock, he discovered Gary having an affair with his wife, Gemma. Gemma panicked when Bull walked in and quickly ran into their son's room without saying anything. Bull was devastated. He never expected betrayal from both his wife and a close friend. However, out of loyalty to Norm, he chose to remain silent and kept Gemma's affair hidden, forcing himself to carry the pain alone. In the days that followed, Bull kept his feelings to himself and focused on taking care of his son, Aiden. Then one day, Norm asked him to come for a private conversation. Norm told Bull that he was the only person in the organization he truly trusted. But he also had difficult news. Since Gemma had chosen to be with Gary, Bull needed to let her go. Norm apologized yet remained firm Bull could no longer stay in the organization. The next day, Bull returned to his old home to pick up Aiden. Although Bull was always tough and ruthless with his enemies, he treated his son with gentleness and care. Soon after, his close friends Marco and Mike arrived with a message from Norm. They invited Bull and Aiden to join them on a trip to a nearby amusement park. At first, Bull refused, saying he wanted to cut all ties with the organization. But Marco reassured him that the trip was simply Norm's way of saying goodbye to both him and Aiden. Moved by their sincerity, Bull eventually agreed to go. At the amusement park, Bull spent the day enjoying the rides and walking around with Aiden. Later, Norm asked Marco and Mike to take Aiden on another ride so he could speak with Bull alone. Once Aiden was gone, Norm suddenly drew a weapon and forced Bull toward the parking lot, where Gary was waiting. Filled with anger and resentment, Bull insulted Gary and accused Gemma of being unfaithful and willing to betray anyone. Norm, furious at Bull for speaking that way about his daughter, struck him with the weapon and ordered his men to lock Bull in the trunk, clearly intending to punish him. They brought Bull to an old, abandoned bus in a remote area. Suddenly, Gemma appeared and angrily confronted him for trying to take Aiden away. Their argument quickly escalated, but Norm eventually stepped in and asked Bull a difficult question: if he were ever separated from his son, what would he do? Bull answered coldly and without hesitation that he would kill anyone responsible. Hearing this, Norm realized how dangerous Bull could become. Not wanting to take that risk, Norm made his decision. He ordered his men to douse the bus in gasoline, then used a bottle of vodka to knock Bull unconscious, preparing to kill him. They left Bull inside the bus and set it on fire without hesitation. From a distance, Aiden managed to slip out of Gemma's car and screamed in terror when he saw his father trapped in the flames. Gemma, panicking, quickly dragged Aiden back into the car and drove away, leaving Bull to die. 10 years passed. By a pickup truck, a familiar figure appeared. It was Bull, somehow alive, fueled by the desire for revenge. With a calculated plan already in motion, he made his first move. Stepping out of the vehicle, he coldly killed one of Norm's former associates, marking the beginning of his relentless pursuit of vengeance. The story then shifts to the home of Norm's eldest daughter, Gemma's sister. When she turns on the lights, she is stunned to find her husband tied up and terrified. Her shock turns to panic when she sees Bull, someone she believed had been dead for years, standing in front of her. Bull coldly asks where Gemma and Norm are, mentioning their old abandoned house. Shaking, she insists she doesn't know and explains that they haven't spoken in 5 years. But Bull doesn't believe her. He remembers that she and her husband once provided the bus where Norm and his men tried to burn him alive, and he refuses to show mercy. With cold determination, Bull kills both of them and continues forward on his path of revenge. The next morning, an older Norm visits Gemma and Gary's new home for breakfast. He brings the devastating news that Gemma's sister and her husband have been murdered. Shocked and furious, Gemma immediately assumes it was done by one of Norm's old enemies. But Norm firmly rejects the idea, insisting he has no enemies left. He suggests that the deaths might have been the result of a robbery gone wrong. Meanwhile, Bull presses on, unwavering in his mission for vengeance. Bull came across a young boy who turned out to be the son of Marco, one of Norm's former comrades whom Bull believed had betrayed him. Bull told the boy to go home and deliver a message. Bull would be waiting for Marco at a nearby park. The boy hesitated but eventually did as he was told. When Marco heard Bull's name, he froze. At first, he dismissed his son's words, but fear quickly took over. He immediately contacted Norm to report what happened and warn him that Bull was looking for him. Norm told Marco to meet Bull and find out if he was really the same man they had believed died in the fire years ago. Before leaving, Marco took a knife for protection and told his wife to lock the house and not let anyone go outside until he came back. When Marco arrived at the park, he was shocked to see Bull alive, something he never thought possible. Overcome with guilt, Marco lowered his head and apologized, saying he had only betrayed Bull because he was following Norm's orders. As time passed and Marco did not return, his wife grew anxious. When his phone finally rang, she answered, expecting to hear his voice, but instead it was Bull. Terrified, she hurried to the park, only to discover Marco's lifeless body the next morning. His death shocked Norm and Gary, prompting them to visit Bull's mother's house. It was then they finally understood the truth. Bull was alive, and he was coming for Norm in a calculated act of revenge. Norm confronted Bull's mother, demanding to know where her son was. Although she appeared frightened, she insisted she had no idea, explaining that Bull had disappeared 10 years earlier. Norm continued to threaten her, warning that he would kill her if she refused to talk. Hours after Norm and Gary left, Bull returned home and discovered that his mother had been murdered. Heartbroken and enraged, his desire for revenge only grew stronger. His next target was Mike, another one of Norm's accomplices. Mike had just picked up his 2 children from school and was walking them home when he suddenly noticed Bull waiting in a parked car. In that moment, it felt like he was seeing a ghost. Everyone knew that Mike, along with Norm and the others, had once taken part in an attempt to kill Bull. Bull stepped out of the car, threatened him, and ordered him to get inside, warning that refusing would cost him his life. As they drove, Mike, terrified, pleaded for forgiveness and begged Bull to spare his children. But Bull stayed cold and focused, demanding to know where Gemma was and insisting that Mike tell him everything he knew. Unsure and frightened, Mike insisted that he didn't know where Gemma was. He explained that he hadn't seen her in 3 years and suggested that Norm and Gary would have more information. Growing impatient, Bull gave him a final warning. If Mike could arrange for Gary to meet Bull at the fairground, then he and his children would be spared. If he failed, Bull threatened to kill them. As the anxious Mike worked to make the call, Bull calmly took Mike's youngest child on a ride at the fair, a chilling contrast to the fear and tension surrounding them. After a while, Mike told Bull that he had reached Gary, who was currently traveling with a waltz troupe. Hearing this, Bull released Mike and his children, allowing them to go free. But Bull didn't stop there. He continued hunting Gary down. When the two finally confronted each other, the atmosphere was tense. Bull pulled out a knife, and Gary, terrified, realized he was facing the man he believed had died years ago. Bull then forced Gary to play a video game while he questioned him, repeatedly demanding to know where Norm and Gemma were hiding. Gary lied, claiming that he and Gemma had separated 6 years earlier and that he didn't know where either of them could be. Bull immediately sensed the lie and left Gary severely injured before walking away. Even though he still hadn't located Gemma or Norm, Bull's resolve remained unbroken. He kept searching. One night, his search led him to a nightclub where he uncovered a drug trafficking operation. Remembering Gemma's past struggle with addiction, he stopped one of the couriers and forced him to reveal where she might be. Bull forced the courier to guide him, convinced the man knew something important about Gemma. Trembling with fear, the courier eventually brought him to one of the city's major drug dealers. Bull asked whether Gemma was one of the dealer's clients. The dealer agreed to provide information, but only for a price. Bull pretended to accept, asking for a drink first. Then, without warning, he pulled out a knife and sliced off the dealer's hand, leaving him screaming in agony. Bull continued to torture the dealer until he finally gave in. Now missing his hand and in unbearable pain, the dealer agreed to take Bull to Gemma's house in exchange for being spared. Bull accepted, and they left together. When they arrived, Bull found Gemma asleep. He woke her abruptly, causing her to panic. The moment she recognized him, she fell to her knees and begged for forgiveness. Unmoved, Bull coldly ordered her to call Norm right away, leaving her with no choice. A short time later, Norm arrived at Gemma's house, armed and expecting trouble. However, he didn't realize that Bull was already there, waiting with a knife in hand. In the intense confrontation that followed, Bull quickly overpowered him. With Norm pinned down, Bull pressed a pillow against his neck while demanding that Gemma tell him where Aiden was. Gemma pleaded for him to stop, but Bull remained cold and focused, determined to get the answers he came for. Overcome with rage, Bull yelled Aiden's name, pushing Gemma into a state of panic. Terrified, she finally confessed that Aiden, the child she had abandoned, was living beneath a bridge downtown. With no patience left, Bull killed Gemma that night. The next morning, he went to the bridge, found Aiden, and took him with him. Bull then brought the boy to a nearby church. At dawn, a deputy arrived at the church, searching for any trace of Bull. The deputy, Cheryl, was actually Bull's former mother-in-law. She had divorced Norm before Aiden was born. When she opened the church door, she was shocked to find Aiden lying unconscious on the floor. The sight immediately raised her suspicions and filled her with fear. Cheryl had believed that Bull died 10 years ago, and seeing him alive again made her question his intentions. She confronted him, demanding answers. Bull remained calm and explained that he wasn't there for revenge. He had come to protect Aiden and give him a chance at redemption. When Cheryl looked into Bull's eyes, she finally understood the horrifying truth. Bull had actually died 10 years ago, burned alive on the bus by Norm and his men. Yet somehow, he had returned driven by revenge and by his desire to protect Aiden. Before leaving, Bull entrusted Aiden to Cheryl's care and thanked her for helping him. With a cold, determined expression, he walked away, leaving behind a story marked by mystery, vengeance, and unanswered questions.